Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now I realise it's been some time since I've showcased any new games. The reason for that is because I've been getting bogged down in a lot of the games which I really enjoy playing and finding excuses, usually my friends asking me to do them, for making more videos about those games. But I thought as it's been a bit over a month since I last talked about something a bit different, I'm going to introduce you to another game which is among my favourites. It's not in the top 10, but I'll certainly put it in the top 20. And it's another classic that some of you may remember from the good old days. And it is, of course, one of Dan Versen's early efforts, Modern Naval Battles. Now, I'm going to have a quick word about that title because, of course, modern needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. This game was published by Worldwide War Games, or 3W, in 1989. So even an optimist like myself has to be slightly careful about applying that term because modernity, I think, has moved on a tiny bit. I may have made similar remarks when I covered Attack Sub. And this game is very much a product of that time as well, as you can tell from the extremely snazzy cards, which I'll have you know were really good for their day. Um, and yes, this game is, despite the fact that it came in a board game style box, 3W seemed to work to this standard size an awful lot. This is a card game entirely. And it would remind really experienced grognards who remember all the way back to Avalon Hill's game Naval Battles. It's very much the same kind of thing. You have ship cards and you have, oh, got ship cards on the reverse there, bunch of civilians, hang on, and action cards. So it's a two-tier card game in that sense, in that you've got your available forces in front of you, represented by all of these fellows, and of course you get quite a lot of ships, all of those. And then players would have a hand of these things, which would enable them to attack the enemy's fleet. It would enable them to defend their own fleet, and there'd be nasty surprise cards. Now, those of you who are more familiar with Dan Versen's more recent games will see a lot of the inspiration for them embedded in this, because a lot of the mechanics survive. I mean, you even see it in the latest iterations of the classic he created, Down in Flames. But to return to the subject of this game, the setting of modern naval battles is, of course, the Cold War, which was perceived to be at its height at the time. When that game was being designed and published, I'm not sure if anyone could really see how close the Soviet Union was to collapse. So the base game gave you a selection of ships and submarines. So you've got USS Hammerhead, a hunter-killer nuclear vessel, the frigate USS Knox, and you get various different classes. I'll see if I can find something spectacular in this pile. Oh yes, all the way up to the pride of the US Navy, and nuclear-powered supercarriers like the Nimitz. As you can see from the layout of the cards, this game actually has a lot of simplicity to it. Like a lot of card games, this was meant to be fast playing and fun. And the idea was, if you played the basic game, Modern Naval Battles, you did not differentiate between the two factions. So what would happen is that all of your players would shuffle these decks together, and you would be dealt a mixed hand of US Navy and NATO allies, Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact cards. So you'd end up with a mixed nationality fleet. It was really one of those things that was difficult for some people to get their heads around. But then if you just wanted a game that was fun, quick to play, blow each other's ships up in a couple of turns, that supplied it. And of course, the reason it was such a quick playing game was because of the simplicity. All the ship cards have the same basic layout, whether they are a destroyer or a supercarrier. So that number, which would face your opponent, is your hull strength. So that's how much needs to be met or exceeded in order to sink the ship. And down here, well, I'll try and use the right finger. Let's stick with Cardiff. That's your victory point value. And that is your weapon range. So you've got missiles, you've got guns. Torpedoes feature in this, of course, as well. As we saw from the submarine, if I can find another one. Let's just go on a quick hunt. Some ships had anti-aircraft bonuses, particularly the the Aegis cruisers, very formidable. Here we go. There's USS Sea Devil with torpedoes. So every weapon had an icon and a rating. So missiles would be rated A, B, or C, normally to account for their size. And that gave you your basic reference for your use of the action cards. So for instance, our old friend USS Sea Devil here would not be able to play that card because that's a C-rated missile and they only have B. So we're talking like a very large cruise missile if it's C-rated. Nor would it be able to play that card because obviously nuclear submarines don't have very many 16-inch naval guns. Yes, the clue is in the card. The US Iowa class battleships are present and playable. However, Sea Devil can play that card because it's a torpedo attack. So you see, it's very much a matter of just matching up your cards with vessels that can play them. And that pretty much gives you your options for the turn. So very, very quick game. There is a bit of analysis paralysis because you do get tough choices. You get things like these dual use cards. In this case, anti-submarine warfare, which you can either play on your turn or you can keep in reserve. And it has its pluses and minuses. Each turn you only have a limited number of actions, so you may be tempted not to use that offensively, even though it has a very high chance of killing a sub. You might choose to use it defensively, where it doesn't cost you an action necessarily, especially if you play it as a blanket defensive card, rather than as a reaction. You can play it as a one-off reaction if you want, but it's only going to hit that attacking sub on a 1. So lots of trade-offs, lots of tense, exciting decisions to make. And of course, for every card action, there was a reasonable chance of having a reaction. These come with a sting in the tail because an evasive action prevents enemy gun and torpedo attacks on you, but it prevents your fleet making them as well, which is an interesting wrinkle. So you're protecting yourself, but you're not really helping yourself either. That required a bit of judgment too. So that was the basic game, and it did really well. And people liked it. It was simple. If purists wanted something meatier, there were chunkier games out there. But if you wanted a quick lunchtime game, this thing was fun. And it's not like you didn't learn about different classes of warships, because I really like the James fighting ships-esque artwork, proper recognition drawings that match the class of ship to a large degree. Inevitably, there were some misprints, but you take those for what they are. But largely, the drawings were pretty accurate, and they gave you a good idea of what these ships looked like. They gave you an idea of what their capabilities were. So it was a light, fun game, based on pretty heavily on reality. And yet you could carry this around in a coat pocket because despite the size of the box, which is, ordinary bookcase sized-ish, you're really just looking at a ton of cards, a couple of dice, which you roll occasionally, action cards, and that was it. Very simple. Now, the response to the game overall was pretty positive. Oh yes, I forgot to just quickly wave this in front of you. The incredibly thin rule book, some of which was commentary and optional rules. So really nothing to this game at all, despite the tininess of the print. People liked the game, but it was obvious to players very early on, and I don't know if he ever said, it was probably obvious to Dan Verssen very early on, that you could do a lot more with this design. And sure enough, a year later, out came Modern Naval Battles 2, the campaign game. Now, the beauty of this is it gave you new cards with new options, gave you some pretty awesome new ships, and generally thickened out the play deck massively. So I was being a tiny bit disingenuous waving these piles of ships at you while talking about modern naval battles, because in reality, quite a lot of them are added by the campaign expansion, and you can tell who the newcomers are because they had a little blue stripe marked with a C. So if you ever wanted to separate them out, you could. And a handful of new action cards, as I say, to bulk out this deck. But what it did, at only a very slight increase in rulebook thickness, was give players hypothetical campaigns that could be played in a real world setting. So you got that. I mean, in terms of the artistic presentation, this is rather insipid. But you could now fight a global conflict if you wanted to simultaneously. That sheet I just showed you was the guiding control sheet, which would allow an admiral or a board of, you could form a board of admiralty with 6 senior commanders aside if you wanted to. And each theatre would have its own detailed control sheet. Again, the graphics are a bit insipid, but they were really good for the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. And more importantly, everything you needed to know was on these cards, because the rulebook was already so incredibly simple. You had everything from the integrated sequence of play to the optional rules specific for that theatre, to missions that could be either randomly generated or they could chain off your previous successes or failures. And there were half a dozen of these campaign missions included. It took what had been a pretty fun beer and pretzels game and took it to a whole new level. It also introduced an enormous load of counters, so you suddenly tracked victory points, damage rules became more involved, but not in an excessive way. You also got rules for land air bases, bombardment missions. They even give you a bunch of civilian ships, so you now escort landing forces or you target enemy convoys. And lastly, and most importantly, the rules governing submarines were bulked out a bit, because in the original game, submarines were a bit dangerous, but they weren't really let off the leash. They had very few attack opportunities because some of the classes only carried torpedoes and there weren't that many torpedo cards. And if you only have, say, 10 torpedo cards in an action deck that thick, your submarine is going to spend most of the time sitting on the bottom waiting for better days, to be honest. But the campaign game allowed submarines to spend... Sorry, I'm looking down trying to find one because I have a point to illustrate somewhere. Come on, submarine. Very hard to find submarines in the Cold War era, have you noticed? They're flipping quiet and they never turn up when you want them to. Please don't say that, that's what they're supposed to do, because they're submarines, obviously. Nope, still looking. Come on, submarines. Here we go. So take this Soviet Alpha class, for instance. Only got a torpedo, nothing else. It's going to spend most of its life on its passive side. Another cool wrinkle I didn't mention earlier in this game, submarines, of course, have the ability to hide. And on their owner's turn, they want to make an attack, they can go active. Does make them a valid target when they do that, but hey, much must be risked in war. So it gave submarines a bigger role, and it even built on clever little wrinkles like this. So the Alpha class, on account of its really high submerged speed, got a bit of a bonus against anti-submarine weapons. Nice touch. You almost wouldn't expect that level of detail in a card game that was this general. Further rules also expanded the role of air wings. Now, previously, you can see the little aeroplane counters there. Your air wings capability was pretty much folded into the capability of your carrier, and it was a constant. So unless your carrier was sunk, its air wing would always fight at maximum capacity. In the campaign game, it suddenly became possible for an air wing to suffer casualties. Now, this could be a problem for the big US carriers because with their massive air wing capacity, in the basic game, they could always rely on having that huge punch available. In a protracted campaign, losses, unless you could get replacements, would begin to be felt. And I've played a couple of campaign missions where, although you desperately want to make something like this the core of your Indian Ocean task force, you can't, because the risk to it is too great because of aircraft losses. It really forced you to think that way. And of course, if you have a high value warship that you've left in port for a mission, that has implications on your victory points. It was all really cleverly thought out, and the system was very nicely put together. So, despite the fact that it's quite long in the tooth, and there's no disguising it visually, this is not the prettiest game out there. When you compare it purely for the artwork to the latest iteration of Dan Verssen's modern Naval Battles, which is published by DVG Games, Dan Verssen Games, I mean, there's no contest. They use proper photos. The iconography's been tidied up. I don't have that game, so I don't actually know what the gameplay is like, but I don't imagine the basics have changed very much. So enough about what you find inside the boxes. I am going to do a demonstration partial playthrough of just a random setup in my next video. But for those who are interested, the two volumes I have now represent only the tip of the iceberg. Several more expansions came out over the course of the early 90s, and they all added more options at a fairly marginal cost in complexity, up to the point where this game was almost Harpoon light without a map. You'll see what I mean about how simplistic it is at its heart when I do the playthrough. But if any of you would like to try this game out for yourself, there was a website called Cold War Naval Battles where well-meaning folk had actually webified this game, all up there as PDF files. You can print out all the cards and the rules free of charge, as long as you don't mind an awful lot of cutting and pasting. All of the games and the expansions are up there. They have tactfully renamed it Cold War Naval Battles, as I say, because the world has moved on. But it's worth giving a try. Watch out for my next video, but I would suggest if you're really keen on this period, or you just like quick, fast-playing games, if you like any of Dan Verssen's other card-based efforts, it's worth at least having a look. But thank you very much for tuning in today. Lovely to see you all as always, and I look forward to catching you in the next video, where I shall quite literally push the boats out and see what happens. Thank you very much for tuning in.